Very much a pleasure to be back here tonight. It's great to see many familiar faces from previous year's lectures, which I either consider to be a testament to my speaking prowess or to Phibbs' ability to bribe you. I'll talk to you later about which one that might be. But actually, I have 2 and 3 very serious levels of acknowledgement that I need to make here. First of all, to our generous support from a variety of American governmental institutions and foundations, to Peter for his invitation tonight. And I'm obligated to say that even though these folks have supported our research, they do not necessarily agree with our interpretations of the findings that we are going to be presenting tonight. And I know I'm obligated to say that Phibbs never agrees with anything I say, so I have to put that caveat up front as well. But a serious word of thanks to Sean Walsh, who's sitting here, who provided some wonderful maps that you will be entranced by later this evening, and Sylvia Tapman-Burris, my research assistant at Wayne State. So, the agency of space, a provocative theme indeed for your lecture series. And I am going to talk about the agency of space in perhaps a slightly different way than an architect would, because I'm going to investigate tonight an aspect of the agency of space that is related to urban neighborhoods, but it's not necessarily just the physical form of an urban neighborhood that I think counts, but its characteristics of its inhabitants, its institutions, and its public services. I hope to measure all dimensions of these aspects of neighborhood later on this evening and to see how it's going to affect minority children. Specifically, what I'm going to try to do tonight with you is to quantify statistically the agency or the independent effect of the ethnic segregation of neighborhoods in one American city on the life chances of low-income African American and Latino children. Now, the scholarly context in America, at least, about segregation is one that says, yes, segregation, a neighborhood characteristic, does have agency. It does affect how children turn out, but how does this work? There have been tons of statistical studies that have found this relationship, but haven't looked inside the black box to see what it is that's actually going on that links residential segregation with outcomes for minority children. There could be 2 alternative ways that this works. One is that it could be that minority neighbors themselves are the key ingredient that have agency on child outcomes. Maybe it's something to do with the cultures and values and norms of minority neighborhoods and neighbors that get inculcated in the brains of children, and that's what leads to certain outcomes. Or maybe it's not what goes on inside the neighborhood at all. Maybe there's external forces in the American economy that tend to, for example, stigmatize people who come from minority predominant neighborhoods, and they're going to get penalized when they seek jobs or other kinds of positions out there in the world. And so in that sense, it's the minority aspect of their neighborhood itself, which is the causal mechanism of why segregation leads to some negative outcomes. But it could be something completely different. It could be having nothing to do with race or ethnicity in and of itself, but rather it could have to do with other correlated aspects of neighborhoods, neighborhood characteristics that, although they're statistically connected to race, aren't really race itself. And so it has to do perhaps with public services. Do minority neighborhoods have systematically weaker public schools? Institutional supports. Do they have systematically weaker institutions and nonprofit sector organizations to help them? Do they have systematically poor access to jobs, either direct geographic access or through the public transportation system? Do they have higher levels of pollution, which makes their children sicker? Do they have higher exposures to violence, which creates all sorts of social, psychological damages to children? So these are the 2 alternative hypotheses that scholars have put out there as to how segregation might negatively affect children, how segregation has agency. But of course, whenever we're talking about race in America, we don't just talk about it from a scholarly context, we have to talk about it from a political context, because it is still the hot button issue in America. And so from a political context, there is a left and right view of this issue as well. The view from the left basically says, there's nothing really important about the racial mixture of a neighborhood in and of itself, but other qualitative characteristics of the neighborhood is what matters. So some of my black neighbors in Detroit will tell me, we don't need white neighbors to have a good quality of life in our neighborhood. What we need are good institutions and safe streets and lack of pollution. The right wing has a very different view of this world. They say that the real issue is that there's something wrong with minority culture, especially African American and Latino in the United States. Not so much Asian. They're the exceptional minority in the United States, goes this stereotype. But the right wing says that, nope, you put a bunch of folks like that together and you're going to get problems, essentially blaming the victim. So there's clearly a lot of hot buttons related to this issue tonight, and I'll be happy to talk about them later on, because I know that ethnicity has some traction here in Australia as well as a public policy issue. And last but not least, though, ideology aside, there is clearly a human dimension to this study, and that is, first of all, from a humane standpoint, we clearly want to have an equal opportunity society, and if neighborhood matters on people's life chances, it's only fair that we think about how this thing works. And even if you don't go for the ethical standpoint, just think of it at pragmatic terms. We know that now most children in the United States growing up are either black or Latino, not Anglo. And so we as a nation have to be damn sure that those children are growing up in the healthiest environments that they possibly can. They're going to be our future workforce. They're going to support me in my impending retirement. All right, so given all that as background, here are my two research questions. Are the odds of low-income Latino and African American youth ever experiencing during their childhood a series of negative events in a variety of domains related to health, exposure, and use of violence, education, and fertility, related to the percentages of Latino and African American residents in their census tracts, which is the American statistical version of a neighborhood? Secondly, if so, to what degree do these statistical relationships persist when controlling for neighborhood indicators of socioeconomic status, safety, housing stock, institutional resources, and environmental conditions in their neighborhoods? So, a foreshadowing, just to prove that there will be text on this slide, Peter. There is going to be an answer. Yes. There are indeed negative outcomes for low-income minority youth that are more likely when they live in predominantly minority-occupied neighborhoods. But, and a big but, these results are due to other inferior attributes of such neighborhoods, not the ethnic composition of the neighborhood per se. In fact, when all these other attributes of the neighborhood are controlled for and their damaging effects are held constant, the ethnic composition of the neighborhood actually generates some positive outcomes for youth. That is to say, greater percentages of your own race as neighbors, if anything, tends to benefit you, not hurt you. Yes, that's the provocative outcome. There's the punchline. Peter can relax. There will be a there by the time I'm done. All right. Our contributions to this study, I think, are as follows. First of all, we are going to utilize data from a natural experiment involving public housing, or social housing as you would call it, in Denver, Colorado, to overcome a problem of location selection bias, which I'll explain in a moment, and thus permit us to make what we think are causal interpretations of statistical correlations. The second contribution is that we are going to have enough observations of both African American and Latino children and youth that we can separate the analysis and say, well, what's happening for one group and another? We don't have to just lump them together and call them minorities, because as we're going to see, there actually are quite unusual and distinctive differences between the two groups. And last but not least, we measure neighborhood in an unprecedented, holistic way. We have over a dozen different kinds of neighborhood indicators, so we hope to capture virtually every aspect of the neighborhood environment for children that modern statistical indicators allow us to capture. So, done with the bragging for a minute, let me give you an overview of how we're going to approach this. We're going to do a special kind of statistical analysis called logistic regression. It's absolutely not important that we get into the technical details of that. But basically, we're going to say, is there a statistical relationship between the probability of a low-income African American or Latino child having a certain bad thing happen to this child during their childhood? And we're going to statistically control for characteristics of the child, like gender and age, and characteristics of their family, which I'll show you in a moment. What we're going to do, first of all, is to say, okay, controlling for all of that, do these bad things happening tend to be related to the racial mixture of this child's neighborhood, which we'll measure by the percentage of Latino residents and the percentage of African American residents. Then we'll take a second step. And we'll say, okay, now let's just not include that aspect of the neighborhood. Let's put in all the other aspects of the neighborhood that have nothing to do with race and see if the relationships still persist between the composition of your neighbors and the probability that a child has a bad outcome. And if they don't, that's suggesting that race isn't the issue. It's the other aspects of the neighborhood that are the real issue. So that's where I'm heading. Let's get there. A natural experiment was our main contribution of this study, and let me explain what we mean by that. The Denver Housing Authority, which is a local public agency that runs social housing in Denver, has operated public housing on a scattered site basis since 1968. This is very rare in the United States. Of course, social housing in the United States, like often here, is done in large-scale amounts, big estates. Yeah, Denver has some of that too. But for several generations now, they've been buying up single-family detached homes and small apartment buildings all over the metropolitan area and converting them to public housing use. So they're scattering public housing in not only good neighborhoods, bad neighborhoods, intermediate quality neighborhoods, all over the metropolitan area. Highly unusual and an important part that we're going to play on. The second more important part is that there's quasi-random assignment of households to these dwellings. What I mean by this is as follows. Basically, there's a long waiting list for public housing in Denver because it's such good quality stuff. And people often wait 2 years to slowly work their way to the top of this waiting list. When they get there, basically the housing authority says, okay, you qualify for a 2-bedroom unit. That 2-bedroom unit that's vacant is over in that neighborhood. That's where you're going to go. And depending on where the vacancies are, at that moment, when you come to the top, that's where you will go. So it's essentially a luck of the draw whether when you come to the top of the list, that neighborhood has the vacancy, or that neighborhood, or that neighborhood. And that's an important feature that we're going to talk about in just a second because it overcomes geographic selection bias challenge. Now, geographic selection bias is one of these great cocktail party terms, right, that you drop to show that you're a real valid social scientist. It'll stop the conversation dead, but at least you'll show that somehow you're pompous. So let me bring it down to a level which I hope is communicated. The basic problem is this. When we see a relationship statistically between a bad outcome for a child if they live in this kind of neighborhood, can we be sure that it's the neighborhood itself which is causing that bad outcome, or could it be something to do with an aspect of that child's parents that we're not statistically controlling for? i.e., could it be that there's something about this child's parents that both led the parent to set up household in this neighborhood, and that same characteristic might affect the outcome in question? Now, let me give you an example of this potential problem. Let me be the hypothetical parent in this situation, and let's imagine that the statistician who's studying me and my child and the outcomes for my child in my neighborhood knows a lot of things about me because I'm going to answer his survey, but any survey is going to leave unanswered certain aspects of deep personality and character. It's got to be the case. There's never been a complete survey, ever. And what the survey that's just been given to me doesn't know is that I am a party animal. I love to party with my homeboys. So what does that mean? It means that when I go out and choose a place to live, I'm going to find a neighborhood with people that I feel comfortable with and that I have a good expectation like to party as hardy as I do. So, if I happen to be of ethnic group X, I'm going to try to live in a neighborhood with lots of other members of ethnic group X because I'm going to feel happy getting together with my homeboys and having a good time. Okay? Well, if I'm also a party animal, it's likely that I'm not going to be sober enough to pay much attention to my kid, especially when it comes to homework. I'm going to say, no, I'm too busy drinking my Carlton draft to have any time to worry about your algebra, kid. Go work on it yourself. Oh, you want to go out and play and in the street and smoke? That's fine, because I'm too busy playing with my boys. Okay? So here is a characteristic of me, the parent, my party-hardy attitude, that leads me both to choose a particular kind of neighborhood and to ignore my child's educational outcomes. That's all behind the scenes. What does the researcher see? The researcher sees my child growing up in a neighborhood with a high proportion of group X, sees a positive correlation. The higher the proportion of group X in the neighborhood, the poorer my child performs in school. Proof, right, that neighborhood X people cause kids to have bad child outcomes. No, clearly in my hypothetical, it's not the neighborhood which is doing it at all. It's this unobserved parental characteristic which is leading both to the child being in that neighborhood in the first place and that child having the bad outcome. Neighborhood has no agency in that world at all. Now, that's a tough challenge for academics to overcome, because you can always make up some reasonable characteristic of parents that your particular survey has not statistically controlled for, so it could be lurking in the background, and thus it challenges the causal interpretation of the statistical relationships you see between neighborhood characteristics and child outcomes. However, if you have essentially a random assignment of people to neighborhoods, it breaks that connection. I may want to live in that kind of neighborhood to be with my homies, but I don't get the chance because the housing authority assigns me to a different kind of neighborhood. So it breaks the statistical connection between these unobserved parental characteristics, like my party hardiness, and child outcomes. And therefore, if you see a relationship between neighborhood characteristics and child outcomes, you can be much more sure that it's the neighborhood that's doing it, not some hidden characteristic of the parents. Long-winded explanation, but believe me, there's been thousands of pages out there written in the scholarly literature about this selection bias problem, and this kind of natural experiment really is quite an advance as a way to try to get around that. All right. So we talked to 710 families, interviewed them extensively for a period of almost 2 years, because they were 90-minute plus interviews, and we got from these families who have lived in Denver public housing for at least 2 years. They may not have been there at the time we interviewed them, but they had been there when they were raising children. We got a whole bunch of life history information. We found out what was going on in their household while they were raising children. We found out all sorts of indicators of what happened to their children in a bunch of domains that I'm going to talk about in a second. And then we got their addresses, every place they lived since they were raising children. And then we matched all of those addresses with neighborhood indicators for the particular year in question. So we built, if you will, a retrospective database, which for all of the children in our sample, we know for every year of their life what was going on in their household, what was going on in their neighborhood, and what was going on with them. What kind of outcomes were they having in that particular year? And that's the kind of data set that we're going to analyze in this particular study. Now, let me give you a background of Denver and its segregation patterns. And I need to say at the beginning that if we were going to pick a city to look at the harms of segregation in, we wouldn't have picked Denver. It is not the biggest segregated city in the United States. My hometown of Detroit probably takes the cake on that one. But it is a reasonably segregated city in terms of some of its dimensions. So let me just give you the sense of Denver in statistics. I'll show you one of Sean's maps in just a couple of seconds. So in terms of its overall racial makeup, Denver, 11%, the United States, 12%, roughly comparable. Latino, though, Denver you see has a much heavier concentration of Latino residents, virtually all of Mexican American stock. But now the next ones have to do with segregation. A D-index, a dissimilarity index, is a score from 0, meaning perfectly similar distributions of races across neighborhoods, to a 100 being complete segregation of neighborhoods. So the segregation of whites versus African Americans in Denver is 61, slightly less than the national average. The segregation of white Anglos versus Latinos is 50, again, slightly less than the national average. Isolation index measures the percentage of your own racial group in your typical neighborhood. So that 36 here means that the typical Latino person in Denver has 36% Latino neighbors, well below the national average. The isolation index, African Americans, and then Latinos, 43% of a Latino, 43% of their neighbors are typically other Latinos. So the segregation as looked at by the isolation index is considerably below the national averages. So the typical African American and Latino child in Denver is growing up in a much more racially diverse neighborhood than is typical in American metropolitan areas. So if we find some kind of impact of segregation in Denver, we suspect we're only getting the tip of the iceberg of what the harms might be in other more segregated American cities. The picture of racial concentrations in Denver looks like this. Again, thank you, Sean, for that. The darker shading represents a higher concentration of that particular group. The blue line represents the city limits of Denver. The extension out to the upper northeast here is a very low density area that's basically incorporating the area around the new Denver airport. That's why that's a funny looking tentacle. The white and light green shaded area in the middle is a major military reservation testing area, so nobody lives there because they test ammunition there. It would be very foolish for them to live there. But you can see large, in this case of African American population, the largest concentration of blacks live in the near north side of Denver, heading toward the northeast and then down toward the southeast. The highest concentration in any neighborhood, though, is 59%. By American standards, that's pretty low. Many Detroit neighborhoods have over 95% African American population. The portrait for where the Hispanic population is concentrated is quite different. As you can see, they concentrate primarily on the west and northwest sides of the city, although on the southeast sides they do have some reasonable concentrations as well. They are more densely segregated in the sense of having heavy Hispanic neighborhoods, though, the highest ones being 85% Hispanic American residents on some grounds. All right, so that's the background of segregation that sort of sets up where we're coming from in understanding how children of African American or Latino ethnicity fare in these different kinds of neighborhoods in metropolitan Denver. Now, the sample that we're going to deal with are low-income youth because their families have been through social housing, so they had to have been very low income to get into our sample. They have been in public housing at least 2 years, and all the outcomes that we're looking at here in this study were after they were assigned to public housing. So what that means is we're essentially running the following thought experiment. We're saying, okay, here's a bunch of low-income Latino and African American kids. Their families get assigned to public housing randomly to this neighborhood, this neighborhood, this neighborhood, and this neighborhood. Now let's see how they turn out differently. All right? The sample that we're going to analyze varies in size depending on the particular outcome. So for example, we have some children in our sample that are relatively young, and so we don't have high school educational outcomes for them because they haven't yet gotten to high school. So here are the outcomes we're going to look at, and the incidence at which these problematic outcomes happened to youth in our sample. I think you can read these for yourself, and that'll give me a chance to take a sip of water. These are all reported by their parents, so of course there is a reliability problem. For some of these kinds of outcomes, we would expect underreporting. So you can see we have outcomes in a variety of domains related to health, being victimized by or using violence, educational performance, and out-of-marital fertility. So, how do we measure neighborhood? Well, in lots of different ways. First of all, we look at poverty rates, which is, back in the time that we were measuring this, basically a family of 4 earning less than $20,000 a year. Percentage of female-headed households, dwellings that are renter-occupied, percentage unemployed in a neighborhood. All of those characteristics of neighborhoods in the United States are so highly correlated with each other that they're not really separate features. They lump together. So we put it all together in what's called a social vulnerability index. Then we also measured other characteristics of the people living there related to the percentage of folks who have a college degree, the percentage who moved in within the last year, the percentage who are foreign-born, and an occupational prestige scale, which basically says how the public rates the occupational distribution of the workers in the neighborhood. If they're all managerial and professional, that would give it the highest score. If they're all day laborers, that would give you the lowest score. We also have a set of variables related to the quality of the environment in our neighborhoods, and this comes from our Environmental Protection Agency. They have combined a series of basically lead-based toxins, which they call a neurological hazard index. Then they have another set of typically airborne pollutants that they call a respiratory risk index. And so we have those measures for aspects of the neighborhood. Our third set of measures come from a local foundation called the Piton Foundation, which pulls together administrative records, in this case from the child protection agencies and from the police departments, to come up with these kinds of crime rates. This measure of property crime rate is not how I understand property crime is defined here. This includes everything that could happen to a property: burglary, vandalism, car theft, all of those kinds of things. The important feature about these indicators is that for our study, we unfortunately could only get them measured at a larger spatial scale, approximately the size of 2 census tracts, or about 8,000 population. That's going to play an important role in a moment. And last but not least, we have sets of neighborhood indicators which are based on the survey respondents themselves. In each one of our surveys, we ask the parent or caregiver, and I use the word caregiver here because sometimes the caregiver of the child in question was in fact not the biological parent, but more likely the grandparent. We asked typically her to rate each of the neighborhoods in which her child had been raised on a variety of indications, and we came up with these different kinds of scales as a result of those responses. The social capital scale has to do with how well neighbors get along, how well neighbors trust each other, can rely on each other in times of trouble, how well they look up to each other and admire them. The social disorder scale weights heavily on local acts of crime and violence. Are people getting beaten or raped? Are houses being broken into, and so forth? The negative peer influences simply asked folks, did you think that there were children in your neighborhood that were constantly getting into trouble? And the institutional resources scale is basically a measure of whether the neighborhood was perceived to have a variety of public services, such as parks, indoor recreation centers, child counseling centers, and local health clinics or hospitals. Now, control variables, meaning variables that we're trying to hold constant, other characteristics of the children and the parents that you think might affect their outcomes. You can see them for yourself. I won't read all of them because I think they're self-explanatory except a few. Characteristics of the caregiver called economic stress. This is an index which would flag situations where the family was having a lot of economic trouble, such as the breadwinner being laid off from the job, not having enough money available to buy food, failing to pay utility bills, being evicted from your apartment, major economic crises kinds of situations. A depression scale has to do with the mental circumstances of the person taking the survey, whether they had health insurance during the period in question, and so forth. All right, results. Now, I'm going to break down these results separately for Latino kids and African American kids, and each of them in terms of whether we're talking about African American neighbors or Latino neighbors, because they're an important difference. So, do African American and Latino neighborhoods generally have better circumstances or worse circumstances for kids? Well, they don't. I mean, just as places, by our scores, they are more socially vulnerable, they have higher population turnover, they're more dangerous in terms of their crime rates, they're more environmentally hazardous places. And that's true whether you look at African American concentrations or Latino concentrations in Denver. In addition, Latino neighborhoods have some other issues. They experience lower prestige in general, lower social capital, they have older housing and more negative peers and social problems. African American neighborhoods in Denver experience worse property crime. So by a variety of indicators, and there's virtually no indicators that suggest that minority-dense neighborhoods in Denver are better places for children. By virtually every indicator that we looked at, you'd think, oh boy, these are not great places to raise kids. Is this going to make any statistical difference that we can see? Well, this gives you some kind of sense of where racial concentrations in Denver overlay with one classic indicator of how well the neighborhood is performing, and that's this American poverty rate. So the shading underneath here has to do with the poverty rate in the neighborhood, with the darker brownish shading suggests more concentrated poverty. The highest shading, the deepest brown color here, represents neighborhoods that are 31% to 71% poverty households. These are very poor places. And obviously the lighter shading goes all the way down to basically 0 to a couple of percentage points of poverty. And then the green dots represent 100 Hispanic or Latino population. What are those? Purple, fuchsia, if you're a fashionista, whatever the color those are. Those represent 100 black population. And you can see that there is indeed an overlay. This concentration of Hispanic population is covering up very poor neighborhoods. You can barely see the brown there. But you can see that pattern persist very much on that northern and western side of Denver. On the eastern side, again, there's some concentrations of both black and African Americans in relatively modest income areas. That concentration right there is Aurora, Colorado, made infamous last year by the machine gunning of people in the movie theater. But there are some variations in this. It's clear that there are some concentrations of both minorities in that long panhandle-shaped horizontal neighborhood up there, which are in very middle-class, non-poor neighborhoods. And for our purposes, that's a really good thing because we have variation in the kind of environments in which low-income kids are being raised. That's why Denver is such an interesting natural experiment, because we don't just have poor kids being raised in poor neighborhoods. We have some exceptions. We have poor kids being raised in very nice neighborhoods thanks to the housing authority, and that gives us some traction on the question we're trying to answer. Again, thanks, John, for this great map. All right, so now some statistical results. Outcomes in African American neighborhoods. So let's see how African American kids fare in African American neighborhoods. So just to standardize everything and get a common yardstick, I'm going to compare standard deviation percentages. So take a standard deviation change in this kind of aspect of a neighborhood. How does this affect the odds that an African American child is going to have a bad outcome? So that's the yardstick I'm going to be using throughout these slides coming up. So if you take a neighborhood that has one standard deviation higher percentage of African American children, total population, an African American child in that neighborhood is likely to have a 52% higher chance of having an asthma diagnosis. Are going to witness violence, the odds are going to increase by 62%. Being victimized by a neighborhood is going to go up by 78%. Using violence themselves is going to be 39% higher. And having a child outside of marriage, 51% higher. So this suggests that if you just looked at how African American kids fared in more African American neighborhoods, you'd say, holy crap, this is terrible. Get those kids away from other African Americans. Hold on. That's not the right conclusion, but you could draw that conclusion if we stopped here. All right, let's flip it around now. How do Latino kids do with higher percentages of African American neighbors? Well, Well, they would have greater odds of being victimized by crime by 82% and repeating a grade by just slightly higher. All right, let's look about how Latino neighbors fare here. How do African American kids do with higher percentages of Latino neighbors? Well, these African American kids would have greater odds of being victimized by violence by 51%. However, there's some offsetting effect. They would have a slightly lower odds of dropping out of high school by 2%. How do Latino children fare in highly Latino neighborhoods? They would have a 56% higher chance of witnessing violence, but again, some offsetting effects, lower odds of using violence themselves, and slightly lower odds of dropping out before a diploma by 2%. So from this very cursory view, it appears that residents for either African American or Latino kids in Latino neighborhoods have mixed outcomes, some bad, some not so bad. But what happened to these relationships when we start controlling for other aspects of the neighborhoods that aren't the racial characteristics? Sorry, I forgot that one. Another good consequence. When all neighborhood attributes are controlled, basically the percentage of Latino and African American residents cease being statistically significant negative predictors, with one minor exception. Instead, there are actually 5 significant predictors that suggest that neighborhood composition of more Latinos or more African Americans provide more favorable minority child outcomes. So the results for having minority neighbors completely flips around when you control for the other aspects of the neighborhood, which are not the racial aspects. Which of those non-racial aspects carry all the water here? Well, 2 aspects stand out. One aspect is property crime rates. Property crime rates in a neighborhood predict all sorts of poor child outcomes, and there's lots of reasons to hypothesize of how that works. It could add to higher levels of stress and fear, and that leads to a variety of psychological and physiological adaptations on the part of kids, which reduces their ability to concentrate and perform well in school. Also, higher property crime rates might be suggestive of local drug markets that give kids an alternative way to earn pocket money besides the legitimate labor force, and that is going to reduce their school performance and draw them into a variety of risky behaviors, which clearly will not be paying off in the long run. The other indicator of the neighborhood that has a lot of traction here is lower occupational prestige. Let me put it in a more positive sense. Lower income minority kids seem to do better in a lot of regards, especially regarding educational outcomes, if they're surrounded by folks of higher occupational prestige. Now, we don't know what the racial characteristics of these higher occupational prestige people might be, but there is something going on which is conveying external benefits to low-income kids in that environment. We don't think it's coming due to interactions on a one-to-one level, because lots of other studies have shown that when you have different economic classes mixing in neighborhoods, they don't socially mix and interact much at all. There's not a lot of intimate interchange. It's not that Bob, a rich person, is inviting Sally and her family, a poor family, over for dinner on the weekends. No, that's not the kind of reactions and interactions that go on. But there must be something going on that's conveying external benefits. That something could be, and we don't know, role models. It could be that higher occupational prestige folks demand a better educational system for all the kids, including the low-income kids that are going there. It could be that these folks demand better public services that the low-income kids benefit as well as the higher-income kids benefit from. There's lots of ways that this prestige thing could work out. We just don't think it's due to interchange and networks of the sense of equal status. There's 2 more aspects of the residential environment besides race that were predictors of quite a few negative outcomes. Higher social problems index, which again is the person's assessment of what's happening right around their house in the neighborhood. Is it a violent, crime-ridden place? Same kind of logic with our overall property crime index, which is measured at a bigger spatial scale. And more negative peers. If the parents think there are more negative peer effects, not too surprisingly, their kids aren't going to turn out as well, probably because they're being socialized by these lovely peers into doing a variety of unproductive activities. Now, there are some results, however, that are surprising. Now, Peter would say any results from Galster are surprising, but these are actually surprising.
This is a lot of results.
This is a set of things that are puzzling, to say the least. Now, I'm going to give you some stories that are attempts to explain these puzzles, but I'm telling you up front, I don't believe them fully. So if you have some other thoughts about what could be going on here, I would love to hear them, and I will steal them if they're good, I promise. So these aspects of the neighborhood were correlated with some positive outcomes for low-income minority youth. You ready? Higher child abuse and neglect rates. Now, at the surface, you're going, what? Well, what were they positively correlated with? Well, for example, controlling for all these other aspects of the neighborhood, we found that neighborhoods that had higher abuse rates, as reported to the authorities, had lower odds of children having asthma diagnosis. Lower odds of children having diagnosis. Now, that could be because places that have higher child abuse rates are healthier places to raise children, and so they don't have symptoms of asthma. That's totally implausible. More plausible, we think, is that there's less likelihood in such neighborhoods for parents to think about reporting the symptoms of asthma to a medical professional. There may be a general blasé attitude about kids in these neighborhoods where, kids are kids, they might be a little sniffly, they might have a difficulty breathing a little bit, but they'll be okay. Let's not worry about them. We don't care that much about them. Let them tough it out. And so what we think could be going on here is a lower likelihood of bringing a child with asthmatic symptoms to a medical provider to get an official diagnosis of asthma because that's too much bother. The second surprising result has to do with higher violent crime rates being associated with some positive educational outcomes. Now, here's a classic example where somebody doesn't think about this too much, says, oh, Galster's advocating if you want to have kids perform better in school, let's have more violent crime in the neighborhood. No, that's not what I'm suggesting here. I'm suggesting that remember what else we have in the model. We have already, as I put on the previous slide, the parents' measures of how violent the immediate environs are around the home. And so it's saying controlling for that, taking two houses that are equally in violent, small neighborhoods, what is the relationship then with crime in the bigger neighborhood? And remember, this violent crime measure is measured at a 2 census tract scale. So it's an area encompassing about 8,000 people, a pretty big area. What we think is going on is this. Parents who think that in the bigger world out there in which their children are going to be operating, going to see friends, going to see a movie, going to school, going to a dance, their bigger social world, not just their immediate environs on the block, but their bigger social world. If they perceive that, for good reason, as a more violent social world, what will they do? I know what I would do. I would restrict my kids' activities. I would keep them closer to home. I would drive them places instead of allow themselves to walk. I would keep them, instead of their friends going out to God knows where to party, I would invite them over to my house to party. I would keep them under lock and key to the extent I could. I would encourage my school to do the same thing, to have after-school activities so kids are not out there wandering around in these more violent environments. That's just to protect the kids. Perfectly logical. We know from a variety of qualitative evidence that parents do that. In more violent environments, they try to restrict the routine activity spaces of their kids. What we seem to be finding is that there is a positive payoff from that goes beyond keeping the kids safe. The kids seem to do better in school, and they're less likely to have a whole bunch of risky behaviors, one of which is having children out of wedlock. So, ironically, this is suggesting that parents may, in their reactions to a more violent circumstance, create a more nurturing, protective, positive environment for their children that shows up in some of our indicators. Again, that's a very provocative finding, but that's what we think is going on here at the Q&A. I would love to hear your alternative thoughts about that. All right, so time to conclude. What we're finding in this study is that the non-racial aspects of a neighborhood in a pretty standard middle-sized American city do indeed have agency. They matter. Yes, we know that at the superficial level, the negative outcomes for low-income minority youth are more likely to happen when they live in predominantly minority-occupied neighborhoods. That's conventional wisdom in the United States. However, this correlation is not causation. It's not that the racial composition of your neighbors is what is causing these negative outcomes. No, it's other inferior attributes of such neighborhoods. Their high pollution levels, their high crime rates, their low occupational prestige, not the ethnic composition, which is causing these outcomes. Racial composition itself, if anything, has slightly positive effects when all these other aspects of the neighborhood is being controlled for. So what does all this mean for urban policy? Well, for someone who has been interested in this topic of segregation and discrimination in housing markets for his entire professional career, which stretches back centuries, I feel, at this point, it's hard for me to say this, but it seems to be the case from this study, that if you want to improve the outcomes for minority youth, who are in fact the majority of youth in the United States today, you have to focus on the quality of the neighborhoods that they are in, but not just on the racial mixture of their neighborhoods per se. Changing the race of their neighbors, and if that's the only thing you change, is probably not going to do anything positive for these kids. It's other aspects of the neighborhoods that you have to worry about. So, obviously that means you have to improve the conditions of neighborhoods where poor minority kids now live, and as well expand the opportunities for poor minority children to move to higher quality neighborhoods through a subsidized housing program, such as the scattered site housing program that Denver operates, or through rental subsidies, which is a more nationally comprehensive program that the United States runs, but it's been very unsuccessful in actually convincing minority families to move to better quality neighborhoods, even though they have enhanced purchasing power. So, what does all this mean? It means that this study, I believe, shows once again that segregation in America, the structuring of space, is a way that we replicate racial inequalities. The United States, I would say, like Australia, has founded itself on being, at least in theory, an equal opportunity society. I think that for many reasons, and this study confirms it, that equal opportunity as a notion is a sham in a segregated society. I'd like to suggest that segregation transforms equal opportunity from a hallowed premise into a hollow promise. I thank you very much for your attention tonight, and I welcome your questions.